At a certain point in time, Halo was shaping up to be a franchise narrowly short of replacing Doom. While the two were never necessarily in competition, both releasing games in 2004 demanded comparison. Even without any video game knowledge, you can look at the two side by side and tell Halo is so inspired by Doom that it's almost a love letter. When it came down to the release, Halo 2 was an exciting and promising step forward for the series, while Doom 3 was just another Doom game. Don't get me wrong, people still loved Doom 3, but it was becoming more and more apparent that a passing the torch conversation wouldn't be ridiculous. Halo played better, had more interesting concepts, smoother gameplay, a more complex and simultaneously easier to follow story. Fast forward to now. One of these is the poster boy of AAA game Highway Robbery, and one is considered the best shooter series of all time. No matter what happens, no matter the odds, Doom always comes out on top. To get an understanding of the reasons that Doom stood out when it first dropped, we need to take a look at what the gaming scene looked like at the time. ID Software had recently released and continued the very well received Wolfenstein series, while Sega and Nintendo firmly grasped the industry. With more simple and family-friendly games like Sonic and Mario, it's not hard to understand why a game like Doom stood out so well amongst competition. And the box art alone, even looking at it all these years later, puts a smile on my teenage boy face. So I can't imagine what it was like compared to everything else back then. But let's not get too hooked on the superficials. The game itself is most simply described as, and I don't use this word often, gnarly. The gameplay loop was simple yet satisfying, and as adored among young men as anything with slaying monsters is. There wasn't as much of a story as a few among the production crew were hoping for, but Doom innovated enough in other areas that the story was accepted as a product of its time. For example, the soundtrack has got to be one of the most iconic ever made. Running around and ruthlessly shredding through demons while listening to the heavy slamming of the drums, the violent yet elegant bass and the passionate lead guitar fit insanely well alongside the gameplay. Every instrument is a slight tweak away from sounding like an incomplete demo song, but it manages to sound like beautiful destruction. The gameplay and soundtrack are a deadly combo, leaving you obsessed with causing more of that beautiful destruction. Unsurprisingly, Doom turned heads and got a lot of publicity, most of it quite positive. It resonated very well with its intended audience, young men. But that resonation was also the worst thing that ever happened to it, putting Doom as the forefront blame for inspiring real-life murders. Doom continued expanding upon that first game, steadily releasing new editions every year. Doom was truly becoming a household name.
Pretty much more popular than football.
And Doomslayer was becoming an iconic figure of masculinity. But in 1997, something weird happened. Instead of making a new game, ID Software released a port of the original for the N64. It introduced a new audience, as computers are understandably considerably harder to get your hands on, but it was somewhat of an odd turn for the franchise. There were a few improvements on graphics and level geometry, but it was a drought compared to how much addition we were used to with each new release. Nowadays, Doom 64 is referred to mostly as the weird one, or just the one you can skip. A phenomenal game as always, but the first time we weren't presented with something special. The release of Doom 64 marked the beginning of 7 years without content.
Daily in the Xbox. This is the product that will be out later this year, and there's an amazing amount going on. First time, let me now unveil Xbox.
In 2001, the Xbox released and would go hand in hand with the young gun of this story for years to come. Halo, Combat Evolved blew people's minds in ways similar to the original Doom. I won't sugarcoat it. Halo was better. In maybe every way except the soundtrack, Halo was undeniably better. I mean, how could it not have been? It was running on better hardware, had been worked on by 8 times as many people, had the privilege of skipping, literally pioneering an entire subgenre of games, and had every cool concept it needed to pull from in one tightly knit package. Without having to worry as much about the size of games as they did in the 90s, Halo was able to fit in a real and awesome story. While I wouldn't dare call it better, the main theme was just as instantly iconic. Animations were more realistic and shooting and killing was far more satisfying. Critics and fans proclaimed that the reason Xboxes were made were for games like Halo. 3 years later, on that fateful year of the franchise's shared release, Doom had a chance to prove it was still king and throw a nasty counterpunch. Doom 3 was an underwhelming, unwanted horror spin, and Halo 2 was simply more interesting, more groundbreaking. Doom still had its deserved audience, but for the first time, it was outshone. Halo went to seemingly take the throne, and ID made mobile games and DLC expansion packs for the time being. The young gun quickly and swiftly became the favorite, leaving its own father in the dust, and went on just getting better and better, creating a story still adored today and a behemoth collection worth every dollar. If it ended there, it would make sense. It would be almost poetic. But somebody else wrote this poem. In 2015, Halo 5 released and people were mad.
Halo 5 Guardians has one of the worst campaigns and stories in video game history.
Like a lot of Halo fans, I didn't like Halo 5. So much so that I beat the campaign and played a bit of multiplayer for a week or two after launch and haven't really even touched it since.
Not really sure who to blame for all of this, because it seems like every aspect of Halo 5's story was screwed up.
Quote unquote, I love the nostalgia of the couch co-op of what Halo did in the past, but I also know the realities of the day. With people's busy lives, it's just not as easy to get everybody in the same physical place. It's one of the advantages that Xbox Live obviously offers. What verbal diarrhea just came out of your mouth? Are you serious?
There's a couple theories I have for why Halo 5's campaign turned out so terribly. 1. Everyone that worked on Halo 5's campaign had no idea what they were doing, what they were trying to do, or how to tell a good story.
It was the second major installment after 343 took over the franchise. Critics seemed to enjoy it, but most diehard fans say that it killed the series and ruined the story, saying that the campaign was not only nonsensical, it was borderline unplayable. Turning the tables, a year later, ID finished a reboot-ish of the franchise simply called Doom, and it was something else. This time around, it was worth the wait. And this is where I really began to understand the hype. Doom 2016 is so spiritually connected to the old games, but it modernized the experience perfectly. The fast-paced exhilaration of feeling both like you were a million times stronger than these monsters, while also being terrified of dying to them, was actually exhilarating to me now. I sound like such a zoomer for saying this, but I needed 2016 to appreciate Doom for what it was. I needed this spoon-fed modernization to help me understand what's so fun about killing things and seeing blood splatter everywhere, with a substantially smaller amount of meaning than I'm used to. The graphics, animation, soundtrack, and atmosphere speak for themselves. It's an improvement in every way to Halo, the same way Halo was to it all those years ago. Doom Eternal released 4 years later, and while it's an improvement to some and a slight downgrade to others, it's my personal favorite of the franchise and solidified that we are indeed so back. Oh yeah, and then a year later, 343 released the beta version of a game for $60, with unbelievably high costs at every corner. It's pretty good now, but the integrity of the decision to release a game at full price before it's finished speaks more to the state of Halo than a completely horrible game would. Just as swiftly as Halo learned from its predecessor and left Doom in the dust, the roles were reversed. Doom never dies.